Welcome to Cary Open, a podcast where we open a window into the world of Cary Baptist College. This episode is a recording from our chapel gathering called Karakia.
Kia ora koutou. We have reached the final chapter of this dramatic book that is 1 Kings. And if we recall the story of Naboth's vineyard from last week, we might remember our favourite antagonist, King Ahab, we just heard about, of the northern kingdom of Israel. So essentially, he decided he wanted a vineyard, and he got a vineyard. By way of his darling wife, Jezebel, framing and murdering its owner Naboth, after Ahab put up a big fuss. So Ahab is a big sook, for starters, and he is incredibly self-deceptive. And we're going to see the lengths that Ahab's self-deception will take him throughout the text today. But I also want us to pay attention to how God's absolute sovereignty extends just as far in parallel to that. So now in chapter 2, the stakes are raised higher. Ahab goes from wanting a vineyard to wanting an entire city, and he's going to do everything in his power to take it. So there'd been 3 years of undisturbed peace between Aram and Israel when he said to his officials, "Do you know that Ramoth-Gilead belongs to us, yet we are doing nothing to take it out of the hand of the king of Aram?" Now during this time, King Jehoshaphat of the southern kingdom of Judah had an alliance with Ahab through the marriage of his son, Jehoram, to Ahab's daughter, Athaliah, and he came to visit him. So Ahab turns to him to ask if he will join him in battle to retake the city. Now, in contrast to Ahab, Jehoshaphat is a good king. The narrator tells us that he does what is right in the sight of the Lord. And Jehoshaphat says two things in response. Firstly, he says, "I am as you are. My people are your people. My horses are your horses. In essence, your war is my war." He is bound by political alliance. But more importantly, he says, "Inquire first for the word of the Lord." In other words, slow down, cowboy. So Ahab agrees to his condition and summons his prophets. So now he has hundreds of prophets at his disposal, about 400 to be exact, and he gathers all of them together to ask them if he should go to battle against Ramoth-Gilead. Now these prophets claim to speak for Yahweh, but each one of them does nothing more than scratch Ahab's itching ears. They say, "Go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king." Like a perfectly united echo chamber, they tell him exactly what he wants to hear. A holy coincidence or a convenient gathering of yes men? Anyway, Jehoshaphat isn't buying it. He insists on a second opinion from a prophet of the Lord, a characterization which, interestingly enough, he doesn't give to the other 400 prophets. And so Ahab says reluctantly, "Well, there is still one other, but I hate him." What a thing to say. "For he never prophesies anything favorable about me, but only disaster." So well done, Ahab. You've really flaunted your own self-deception here. It's clear that he cares more for favorable, flattering prophecies than he does for prophecies of the truth. But come on now, let's be honest. Who doesn't appreciate a favorable prophecy in the place of cold, hard truth? As Paul told us 2 weeks ago, we are Ahab. So anyway, Micaiah is summoned, and the narrator takes us straight into the next scene, where Ahab and Jehoshaphat are dressed in their royal robes, sitting on thrones at Samaria's gate, with all the prophets prophesying before them. And one prophet, Zedekiah, who thinks he's the big dog, has made himself some iron horns for show and tell, and he waves them around as he tells Ahab what all the other prophets have already told him. Now along comes Micaiah, pre-warned by his messenger to fall in line with everyone else and make sure his words are favorable. There's no room for the truth here. Everyone is on board with Ahab's self-deception, whether they realize it or not. And so when the king asks him the same question he asked the other prophets, he follows suit and replies sarcastically, "Go up and triumph. The Lord will give it into the hand of the king." Now, it's important to note here, and we'll circle back to this, that before saying this, he makes a promise to speak only what the Lord tells him to speak. He hasn't technically promised to speak the truth. And so, as he carries on, we'll notice that Micaiah saying only what the Lord commands him to say means to speak both what is false, in this case, and what is the word of the Lord. Anyway, Ahab sees his sarcasm and snaps back at him, saying, "How many times must I make you swear to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" Now, the irony and the complete audacity of the man, demanding the very truth that he doesn't want a bar of. I think his reaction is interesting, though. Micaiah's told him what he wants to hear, and yet he remains unconvinced. And now he knows Micaiah is an uncompromising truth teller. So this tells us that maybe something within him is wrestling with this uncertainty that maybe his war efforts aren't justified. Maybe there is a small shred of reason remaining that recognizes truth from falsehood. Anyway, it's reasonable to claim that Ahab is a deeply insecure man who is clinging to his self-deception for the illusion of control. So now it's on, and Micaiah replies, "I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains like sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, 'These have no master. Let each one go home in peace.'" So if it isn't obvious here, Micaiah has just foretold the death of our favorite royal sook, the shepherd of Israel. So Ahab turns to Jehoshaphat, and he has a little pout, as expected. And I mean, surely by this point, I feel like Jehoshaphat must be looking at this guy thinking, "Man, you're an egg." But then Micaiah pulls out the big guns, and he continues saying, "Therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, with all the host of heaven standing beside him, to the right and to the left of him. And the Lord said, 'Who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead?' Then one said one thing, and another said another, until a certain spirit came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, 'I will entice him.' 'How?' the Lord asked him. He replied, 'I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets.' Then the Lord said, 'You are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do it.'" So you see, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has decreed disaster for you. Now it's important we linger in this for a moment, because this is big. Ahab's self-deception is intended by God. Ahab's death is decreed by God. Now that's a lot to wrap your head around. And there's an interesting parallel here. In Ahab's council, he has 400 prophets affirming his desire to get what he wants. But in Yahweh's heavenly council, we see the almost terrifying irony. These same 400 prophets are unknowingly serving Yahweh's purpose by giving Ahab over to his destructive desires. They are bringing him down simply by telling him what he wants to hear. Yet it is so important to note that while Yahweh is giving Ahab over to his desires, he is not taking away all his options. God still provides Ahab with an out in the form of Micaiah's truth-telling. So Ahab is not at all being blindsided here. He has full agency of choice. So if we recall Paul's sermon from chapter 20 2 weeks ago, he encouraged us to pay attention to what God does and doesn't do in the text and in the world of today. He governs the final verdict for our lives, but he completely honors our choice. If we recall Chris's sermon from chapter 21 last week, he reminded us that injustice always leads to death. Ahab's unjust and deceitful behavior throughout 1 Kings would ultimately pave the road to his own death. And what is so beautiful here is that by freeing the sheep of their unjust shepherd, this is God's own sovereign act of justice, that would ultimately restore life and peace to Israel. So I think this just speaks volumes to the extent of God's sovereignty that is at play in this text. Now, Zedekiah does not like this at all. I mean, this guy is enraged, and so he strikes Micaiah on the cheek. I mean, firstly, Micaiah has just completely stolen this guy's thunder. He's probably feeling a little bit silly about his iron horns. And secondly, he's essentially exposed him and all these hundreds of other prophets as frauds. That's got a sting. And so he says sarcastically to Micaiah, "Which way did the Spirit of the Lord pass from me to speak to you?" In other words, he's saying, "Are you not also inspired by the same so-called lying spirit?" But Micaiah has remained completely untouched. If we recall earlier on in the passage, he makes a promise to speak only what the Lord has told him to speak. He speaks the false prophecy first as a way of getting Ahab to admit that deep down, he knows the other prophets aren't telling him the truth. Micaiah replies, "You will find out on that day when you go in to hide in an inner chamber." Or, in other words, when your king is dead and you are hiding in fear. So at this point, Ahab has had enough of Micaiah and sends him off to prison. And he anticipates that he'll deal with him once he returns in peace. But as we know, Micaiah's vision has claimed that fate for the rest of Israel only. So Micaiah parts from the narrative with a final challenge. "If you return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." And his famous last remark, "Mark my words, all you peoples." Here lies the grim reality of Ahab's self-deception. He is close enough to hear a prophetic voice of truth, but still far enough to believe that the victory is his. So King Ahab and King Jehoshaphat go up to battle against Ramoth-Gilead. And catch this, Ahab decides that he's going to take an additional security measure by entering the battle in a disguise. And consistent with his character, he decides that Jehoshaphat will enter wearing his royal robes. Now, this is the ultimate display of insecurity. This man has 2 military forces at his command, yet he chooses to hide in plain sight. I think it's incredible that, in contrast to Ahab's cowardice, despite all his worldly power, Micaiah can still stand boldly in the face of imprisonment and declare with full-bodied confidence that the Lord's word will have the final say. I mean, does that not inspire hope in us that we can put all our confidence in the same sovereign God who exists today as we remain loyal to his word, even if the world around us would stand against us? But then when have each of us not taken additional security measures to ensure our own success when we put our hope in anything or anyone that isn't God? We are Ahab. Now, by any ordinary outcome, Jehoshaphat should have been killed pretty quickly. But as we know, this is no ordinary situation. This is a battle that was orchestrated from on high. And so his life is spared while on full display in his royal robes. But Ahab is struck by an arrow from a random soldier, and it manages to find precisely the most vulnerable part of his armor, between his scale armor and his breastplate. Now, I like how the NRSV uses the language "unknowingly struck" to emphasize the fact that this was purely incidental from a human perspective. This soldier had no idea that his arrow had struck the king. And I think the narrator makes it abundantly clear that there was no possible way Ahab could hide from his fate. It was already decided. And ultimately, no human strategy, disguise, or clever plan can escape the purposes of our sovereign God. His word has the final say. So the battle rolls on, with King Ahab watching from the sidelines while he slowly bleeds to death in his chariot. He dies just as evening arrives. And with the setting of the sun, a cry goes throughout his army, "Every man to his city, and every man to his country." Finally, the shepherd has fallen, and the sheep scatter. The word of the Lord has been fulfilled. Now they buried the king in Samaria, and they washed off his blood-stained chariot by the pool of Samaria. And what do you know? Along came the dogs to lick up his blood. And it was also there that the prostitutes bathed themselves. So Elijah's prophecy in the previous chapter, verse 19, is fulfilled. Thus says the Lord, in the place where dogs licked up the blood of Naboth, dogs will also lick up your blood. Where Ahab wanted a glorious legacy, God governed the final verdict, which was utter humiliation. His own royal blood was washed away in an unclean public pool used by people who were the outcasts of society. The word of the Lord has prevailed again. The word of the Lord remains. The psalmists provide us with a fitting reminder in Psalms 146, verses 3-4, saying, "Do not put your trust in princes, in mortals in whom there is no help. When their breath departs, they return to the earth. On that very day, their plans perish." So look at the lengths that Ahab's self-deception extended to in the text. And yet look at the reality of God's absolute sovereignty in parallel throughout the narrative. Now ask yourself, what has remained? Who has the final say?
The Baptist NZ Podcast Network.